Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third breakout session. My name is Rick Knight. I'm one of the CCL volunteers from Chicago, the southwestern suburbs of Chicago. And this breakout session is called Energy, Innovations, and Transformations. We're going to talk about what kind of things to expect in the future of energy. Defeating climate change requires a massive transformation of our worldwide energy systems, sources, and infrastructure. There's more to it than wishing 1 billion solar panels into existence. So here we have a lineup of nationally recognized experts who cover the spectrum from electricity generation to vehicles to building efficiency. And climate change and energy are inextricably linked. And I'm honored and thrilled to introduce this esteemed panel who will help us foresee what the future will hold in energy. First up, I'm going to introduce Ms. Ellen Vaughan from the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. Ellen launched and now leads EESI's High Performance Green Building Initiative. She develops and promotes policies that maximize the use of energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sustainable materials in buildings. Ellen has more than 25 years of experience on building-related policy issues, having previously worked for Stephen Winter Associates, a research design and consulting firm for high-performance buildings, and also for the Air Conditioning Contractors of America. She has participated on National Academy panels, testified before the U.S. Congress, and authored and co-authored a number of significant articles on buildings and energy. Please welcome Ellen Vaughan.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick. I could just walk up and down the aisle if I wanted to, right? I do not have a slide presentation. I just wanted to cover a few points that I think are critical in the area of buildings, and maybe some takeaways that might help in your meetings tomorrow. And the panel, we're really kind of all connected here in more ways than one. But sorry, yeah, I wasn't actually. Is this better? Wasn't actually doing what I was supposed to do. Just first of all, EESI, Environmental and Energy Study Institute, it's a not-for-profit here in DC. We do policymaker education. We actually came out of a congressional caucus in 1984. And so we're trying to bring science to the policymaking process, but in a way that is understandable for policymakers. Some of you might have been in the congressional staffer session, and these are dedicated and smart people up on the Hill for the most part, but so busy, and they just can't possibly know all of these issues. So the more that we can make it easy for them in talking points that are factually correct and easy to understand is really important. So that's the kind of work that we do. So I'd really like to thank you all for augmenting what we do every day by being here. I am so impressed by this gathering and the number of people that are going up to the Hill. Over a decade ago, this was before I was at EESI, but our board of directors, had a board action that climate change is a moral imperative. And that's what guides us in our work. So greenhouse gas emissions, if you will, are sort of the lens through which we look at everything. And of course, it's the moral imperative, but it's, as we know, sustainability is about economics, it's about social justice, and it's about the environment. All of those things have to go together. So EESI is looking at really all major sectors of the economy. We'd like to focus on a lot more things, but we're fairly small. But we're looking at buildings, which I'll talk about, transportation issues, agriculture, forestry, sustainable biomass, those kinds of things, but really focused on renewable energy and energy efficiency. Sustainable energy, how does that relate to climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, frankly? And why there are the multiple benefits that we see in renewables and efficiency. We really want, right now, we really need to continue the momentum of the Paris Climate Agreement, so I'm sure you can agree. And the Clean Power Plan here in the US, even though we have the Supreme Court stay, there are, I think, 25 states now that are continuing with their implementation plans. So, this is, some states have been working on this for a long, long time, even before EPA came out with its rule. So we really want to keep this momentum. In November, it's anyone's guess. I'm sure there are a lot of bets on this, but we're going to have we know we're going to have a new White House, a new administration, and we're going to have a different Congress. Exactly what that is going to look like, we're not sure. But there are opportunities at both the federal level and the state and local level for pressing our message and educating policymakers. So in buildings, at the federal level, really, I think of one of the most critical things as the R&D and the federal private sector partnerships in energy efficiency and renewable energy. The Department of Energy is one of the biggest funders of energy efficiency, technology development, and renewable energy, and they have partners in the private sector. And when Congress is writing energy authorization bills and energy and water appropriations, I think it's always important to talk about the role of this research that the private sector, one entity might not have the capacity or incentive to do. The feds can lead by example in their buildings. They can put out procurement specs that favor energy efficient net zero energy buildings, and I'll get to that in a second. But also there are tax credits, as you know, and I think energy efficiency, renewable energy tax credits, along with many others, there's probably going to be, or there's talk of a tax extenders bill again this year, but that's just conjecture as to what that would be. But if there is a price on carbon, if there is, sort of when the externalities of fossil fuel use are baked into our system of tax policy and housing policy, then perhaps we won't have a confusing system of tax credits that get extended for a year, and then you have to go back and try to get them re-extended. The building sector, I think of, and former Energy Secretary Stephen Chu has called it this as well, kind of the low-hanging fruit, if you will. It's the one sector where we really have the potential, it really has the potential to produce more energy than it uses. It's not that it's going to be an easy thing to do, but the potential is there, and there's a lot of good things that are happening, and there's a lot of waste right now. Buildings use about 40% of our total energy in this country, including 70% of the electricity, and much of that comes from fossil fuel resources. 40% greenhouse gas emissions, give or take, are from the building sector. How am I doing on time?
2 more minutes.
About 2 more minutes. So the good news is that we can dramatically reduce energy use in the building sector, and we can do it now. And we have technologies that are fairly cost-effective to do now. Again, smart policies will help and provide incentive for homeowners, for building owners, for people to do this, because the existing building stock, frankly, is the holy grail. That's the big problem. New construction is only about 1% of the building stock. And yet, at the same time, we don't want to design in another 50 to 100 years of energy waste. So building codes for new buildings, new construction, are incredibly important. That is regulated primarily, it's regulated at the state and local level. So it's a little trickier to talk about in Congress. And again, energy efficiency is really what we have to do first, because there's so much energy waste. And we can dramatically reduce the energy load in buildings. Has anyone heard of the HERS index, the Home Energy Rating System scale? People say, well, that's not a good system, or it is a good system, but regardless, it's sort of well known, and it kind of rates buildings, if you will, the lower the better. So a zero energy building, one that basically produces as much energy per year on site as it uses, is a zero. And this is where a slide would have been good. But 150 or more is a very wasteful building. Most buildings are 100 to 150. Energy efficient buildings, sort of the reference home, the latest code is about 100. Energy Star would be lower. Passive house and Living Building Challenge, which references passive house, can be almost zero. It really, because what you're doing is you're optimizing the thermal envelope. And that is the most important thing, is to seal up the leaks. Insulation, good windows. Then you want to address indoor air quality. And you have to be mindful of appliances. Again, DOE does appliance standards, and then Energy Star goes above that. And then when you get your energy load way down, then you can add renewables cost effectively. And as you've seen, solar, for example, has gone way down in price. So net zero energy buildings are possible now. They are being designed, they're being built. I could talk a long time about other attributes, high performance attributes, security. You know, the greenest building in the world that falls down in a strong wind is not sustainable. So we have to be thinking of all these attributes, accessibility, but you know, we're here to talk about energy. But really that is the core, and that's what's going to bring you cost savings to do some of these other things. There are social justice issues we need to think about, affordable housing, elder care. But again, we can do this. How? Standards, I'd like to just say standards are really important. There's a lot of confusion out there. There's LEED, there's Energy Star, there's Passive House, there's all these things. I would just point out that there should be some consistency. There's a lot of good things happening, but I'll give you an example, and this might come up for you sometime, maybe you know, meetings with your local leaders. When there's a local government, I won't name names, in the DC area that let out an RFP, and they wanted net zero energy buildings. But they said, well, you could use Passive House, you could use this, they really didn't know what they were talking about. With a LEED building, you're not necessarily going to get an energy efficient building. With Passive House, you're going to get super energy efficiency, but yet it doesn't have green. So if you want a certification, you really have to know what you're talking about. Financing, again, I mentioned that's a critical issue. It might be resolved, I think, when we have some better ways of looking about carbon pricing. And we've got two other panelists, so I'll close it out, and I thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for what you're doing.
Okay, thank you so much, Ellen. Our second panelist to speak will be Dr. Eric Larsen. Dr. Larsen leads diverse energy research at the science communication organization Climate Central. Let me get his face up there. I'm wasting time doing this. Okay. And Eric actually has a presentation, which I will load right now. Okay. There it is. Okay, as I said, Dr. Eric Larsen is with Climate Central, also with Princeton University. His recent activities have included assessing climate-friendly cars and methane leakage from natural gas systems. He also provided technical analysis of future global warming under alternative energy scenarios published jointly by Climate Central and CNN in advance of the Paris conference. Eric is also a senior research faculty member at Princeton University's Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. His research includes engineering, economic, and policy-related systems analysis of a wide variety of advanced technologies and resources. He collaborates with colleagues worldwide and has published over 200 papers. With a PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of Minnesota, please welcome Dr. Eric Larsen.
Thank you, Rick. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first introduction to your organization, and I'm thrilled to be learning all about it in these sessions. I attended the REMI study session and learned a lot about the REMI study, which I hadn't known. A lot of good work being done. Rick asked me to talk a little bit about transportation, and what I'm going to talk about are the challenges, and I think many of you are familiar with some of what I'm going to say, so forgive me if I'm preaching to the choir here. So these are U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. I think everybody knows this kind of pictures. What I wanted to stress here in the pie chart is that transportation is about a quarter of our emissions today. And down at the bottom here, our goal as a nation is to get to something like 80% or more reduction in total emissions by 2050 relative to 2005. And that's a huge goal, as Rick pointed out in his introduction. You could think about it as cutting out the three darkest pieces of the pie. That's about 80% reduction, so we could meet agriculture and direct energy use in commercial and residential buildings, and we would meet this 80% reduction target. All right, so electricity, transportation, industry, those are all huge areas where reductions are needed. And I thought it might be useful to bring it a little bit closer to home and just show you some numbers about, on a per capita basis, what this means to reduce emissions by 80%. And so these are calculations I use in one of my classes just to give you some idea of what the emissions are. If you drive 12,000 miles a year in a 25 mile per gallon car, which is the average efficiency of a new car today, you put out about 5.5 tons of CO2 per year. If you heat your house in the Northeast with natural gas, it's about 5 tons of CO2 per year, average house. Average house electricity use, it's about 7 tons per house per year. And if you fly about 10,000 miles, you're about 4 tons of CO2 per year. And if you distribute these over, assume a 4-person family, for example, in a house, and that's what the little calculation is, I come out with about 12 tons per person per year, just for your personal sort of carbon footprint, the average US. And so if we're reducing by 80%, we want to bring that down to 2.5. So you could heat half your house for that, and none of the rest of the stuff. No transportation, no flying, no nothing, right? So it's a huge reduction we're talking about, and I wanted to look at what the prospects were specifically in transportation for getting to that kind of reduction. This is a little bit complicated, so I want to take just a minute to explain what I'm showing here. I'm showing you what the life cycle CO2 emissions are per year for a vehicle, depending on what type of vehicle it is, either a gasoline car, the dashed lines, or an electric vehicle, the solid lines, and depending on how many miles per year you drive. So the black bars are 15,000 miles per year. The average US miles per year is about 12,000 right now. And it seems to be stabilizing at that, so 15 might be a little bit aggressive there. The green line is 10,000, and then the blue line are 5,000. And the circles in the middle of the line is the average efficiency of a new car in 2016, 25 miles per gallon. So driving 25 mile per gallon car, 15,000 miles, you put out about 7 tons of CO2 per year, okay? The star on the left end of each bar is what the fuel economy is going to be in 2025 for the average new car. So in 9 years from now, we're going to have cars that get 55 miles per gallon on average as a new vehicle. All right, so that's where we're headed. So I hope that at least you understand what I've shown here. And now if we look at the endpoints of the black dashed line, the circle is the average of a new car today, but you can buy a car that'll, and I've shown that this is a Mercedes SUV, will put out 14 tons of CO2 per year on the right end of that dash line. On the left end of the dash line is the most efficient gasoline car you can get, is a Toyota Prius Eco, they call it. It's a 56 mile per gallon car, and that's on the left end. And so that's the range for each of the dashed lines, okay? So we go from a Mercedes SUV that gets 12 miles per gallon to the black circle. That's about a doubling of the fuel economy to 25 miles per gallon. And then we double it again to get to the left end of the star. And what you're seeing is that if you have really inefficient vehicles and you improve the fuel economy, you get a big gain. But as you get to the more efficient vehicles, changing the fuel economy gives you less and less gain. So it gets harder and harder to get pushed down to the left on that curve. That's one important observation. The other is looking at where the electric vehicles lie. So this is the average emissions of the grid assumed for the electric vehicles, and the range there is shown for, again, the range that you can buy on the market today. The right-hand end is a Tesla S90. The left-hand end is a BMW i3. And what you see is that for the average electricity mix in the US, the annual CO2 emissions for an electric vehicle are comparable to the most efficient gasoline vehicle. All right? Not hugely better one way or the other, but a lot better than the average gasoline vehicle. All right? But this is an average picture for the US. What makes a difference is where the electricity comes from for those electric vehicles, and this is some analysis that we did. This just shows you for all 50 states what kind of fuel is used to make electricity. Black is coal, orange is natural gas. Those are the two main fossil fuels. And so if you're driving an electric vehicle in West Virginia, Kentucky, Wyoming, Indiana, Missouri, North Dakota, those high coal states, you're probably going to be a lot worse than a gasoline car. If you're driving one down in Idaho or Maine or Vermont or Rhode Island, well, Rhode Island's got a lot of natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, you might be better. And we did a comparison this is a couple years old now, but it's not too different than what it would be today. State by state, what the electricity generation mix is, assume it drives a Nissan Leaf, which is about the most efficient electric vehicle you can get, and compare that against a Toyota Prius driving on gasoline. And there's only 13 states where the electric vehicle would be better in terms of a carbon footprint today. And so that's something to think about when you're buying your next car. And I wanted to just finish by showing a bunch of questions, because I wasn't sure where we wanted to go with the discussion, but these are all questions that I think about when I think about transportation. How much of an impact are electric vehicles really going to have? Or will liquid fuels continue to dominate? And if electric vehicles do come in, how rapidly can we decarbonize the grid? And within decarbonization of the grid, is it enough to go from coal to gas, which everybody is quite excited about, or a lot of people are excited about? going from coal to gas. That's still a fossil fuel. It's better than coal in most cases, but is it enough to get to where we want to be in the longer term? What happens to the fuel economy of gasoline cars after 2025? So 2025 is the legislated end of the current CAFE standards mandate. We'll be at 55 miles per gallon for a new car at that point on average. But as you saw from the horizontal line graph that I showed you, there's still room to improve. Biofuels, I haven't said anything about biofuels. I've done a lot of work on biofuels over the years, and what impact can we have with those, because potentially those are a less carbon emitting liquid fuel that can replace petroleum fuels. There's a lot of hype and a lot of excitement about driverless cars, and what's going to be the impact of driverless cars on energy use in transportation? Are people going to say, well, it's much easier for me to just call up one of these driverless cars and take me somewhere, so I'm going to travel that much more? That's one scenario. Another would be that the software is such that you really optimize the way cars move around in a city, and that may end up reducing transportation energy use. And I think a big question that can have a huge impact, which I didn't stress on that first graph, but as you reduce your mileage driven per year, you of course use less energy. And so we as Americans, are we going to continue driving as much as we do, or is society going to be reorganized in a way that we consume less? So those are just a few questions I think about, and I hope we'll have some time to talk about them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Our last speaker is Mr. Mike Panfil from, hold on here. Get that out of there. From the Environmental Defense Fund. Okay, Michael Panfil is a senior attorney and director of federal energy policy for EDF's Clean Energy Program, whose work includes federal, state, and regulatory efforts across the country to design a more economic and efficient electric system. Michael also engages on efforts to reduce U.S. emissions by advocating for the deployment of smarter technology, improved design standards, and sustainable practices. He has extensive experience with the FERC Orders 745 and 1000. Maybe you'll explain what that is. And with the EPA's Clean Power Plan. He's also actively engaged in state-level utility matters in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and my home state of Illinois, and previous advocacy for demand response, smart grid technologies, and time-variant pricing enhancements in California and New York. And we let Michael go last because we feel that this is what ties it all together. A lot of the energy transition we need to make is involved with electrification, both for buildings and for transportation. So let's welcome Michael Panfil.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. So I did not bring slides, so we'll all instead have a fantastic opportunity to look at just a fantastic picture. I was running, I think, on 36 hours with no sleep when that was taken. Well, I looked very professional. Anyway, I am delighted to be here. I think that this is an incredibly important gathering. I think that as we progress, as we see real change to our electric sector, we're going to need advocacy from the grassroots level on up. Because, and this is going to be a consistent theme throughout my short conversation here today, the technology in many cases is already there. And what we really need to do is see a system put in place, an electric grid put in place that works with that technology, that works with technology that is cost effective, that is reliable, and is environmentally friendly. So it's a little bit difficult to talk about where we're going without talking about how we got here. The electric grid itself has been called many different things. The one in the United States has been called the biggest machine ever built by man. I actually don't disagree with this description. When you think about what the electric grid is, it stretches throughout the United States through enormous transmission. It's connecting large centralized generation, feeds throughout the country so that electricity produced in state X can be consumed in state Y. That's incredible that we built that. And it's even more incredible when you think about how electricity works. Electricity has one truism. Supply must always equal demand. What does that mean? It means that if you ever have not enough supply or too much demand and not enough demand, that's how you experience a blackout. So the easiest way to think about that is if you were to go to a store, buy, I don't know, an apple, you go home, you've got a delicious apple, you're very excited about the apple. Somebody else goes to the store, they also want to buy an apple because they're delicious, and they're all out. So they go back into the storeroom, they go look into storage, try to find more apples, still no more apples. They go home disappointed. In that instance, you still have your delicious apple. With electricity, the fact that they didn't have enough supply to meet demand means that your apple magically disappears, right? That's a blackout. That's what a blackout is. It's when you have too much demand and not enough supply. So the way we make sure we don't have a blackout, the way we make sure we ensure reliability, is that we forecast out how much electricity we're going to need for the next 10 years, the next 5 years, the next year, the next hour, the next 15 minutes, so that when we turn on even a little bit of electricity, somewhere out there is supply to match that demand. And by and large, this system has worked. We have an interconnected grid that extends throughout the United States. Just about everybody has access to electricity here in the United States. But I think, I would argue, that we now not only need a connected grid, but we need an efficient one as well. And so I am glad I actually did go last because I can rely upon some great thoughts already shared, including the fact that electricity mix really does matter, right? Including the fact that building efficiency is critical. There's a recent study out there by, well, I guess not that recent, but by International Energy Agency saying that energy efficiency is 3 times cheaper than the next most least cost fuel. I mean, think about that. Any other industry, if you told them if you make your processes more efficient, you're going to save 3 times more money than any other action. Right? It's a no-brainer. Right? That suggests that our system can become much more efficient. And efficiency has real-world value. Right? It means that we do things for lower cost. If you're making or using less to make the same product, that's less expensive. It's also typically more reliable, right? We talked about blackouts. If you're able to size your grid efficiently, you're going to see a greater or more reliable system. And lastly, and very importantly, if you have these efficiency gains, you're going to have environmental benefit. So you see a trifecta of very, very positive developments, right? Cost savings, reliability, environmental benefit, by making our electric grid itself more efficient. So how do we do that?
Can you hold the mic up?
Yeah, can you hear me better now? Yeah. Do I need to start again?
Yes.
Oh, this is a lot better. It's a fantastic machine. I would wager that you need 2 general buckets of action. Right? The first I'm going to generally call the smart grid. The second bucket I'm going to call a distributed energy future. What do I mean by these terms? Smart grid, all right, when you think about electricity, electricity typically or traditionally is flowed one way. From the utility, the person using the utility, or using the electricity. Information has flowed in the inverse way. Homeowners' information is collected by the utility so they know how much to charge an electric user at the end of a month. Right? A smart grid is a communication overlay so that information flows in multiple directions. That means that rather than understanding how much electricity you've consumed on average a month after you've done it, you actually can tell how much electricity you're using in real time, what the cost of that electricity is. Right? So we have something along the lines of, it's called Automated Metering Infrastructure, AMI. It's basically a backbone technology that allows homes, businesses, smart devices to understand energy consumption as it occurs. And this communication overlay is incredibly important. Right now, without it, there is a blackout if there's a severe weather event. The way a utility knows that there's a blackout on the system is typically because customers call the utility. With AMI, they can pinpoint where, how, when a blackout occurred. That means greater reliability, greater resiliency in the face of a storm or a blackout. It also enables a lot of technology that Ellen touched on. So here we're talking about things like greater efficiency, not just generally, but at particular points, demand response, the ability to know when energy is the cheapest, and so you can plug that into smart devices, so your washer or your dryer or what have you, anything that uses electricity can run when energy is cleanest and cheapest. It means knowing where on the grid it makes the most sense to install solar, distributed generation, microgrids, clean energy technology, so you take care of not only energy issues, but also transmission issues. And that's a smart grid. And make no mistake, we actually have just about all of this technology already. And in many states, they are implementing this technology. And the issues that surround this technology are not, let's make this technology smarter, faster, bigger, better, although that's obviously a good thing. By and large, it's policy change, it's regulatory, it's legal. It's making sure that we have a system of laws in place, of regulations in place, that work with this new technology, this more cost-efficient, this cleaner technology. Same is true for distributed energy. Distributed energy, again, if we go back to our map of how energy works, information flows from the consumer to the utility, energy flows from the utility to the consumer. Again, we see a multi-directional system. No longer is building out large central generation necessarily the cheapest option, right? Worlds in which rooftop solar on a homeowner's house, distributed generation, microgrids, battery storage can be used along the grid are cost effective, are more reliable and resilient, right? And they're also more environmentally sustainable. How many more minutes do I have? 2 more minutes, perfect. So let me just say I think we need 4 key changes to see this world. First is we need to let these distributed energy resources into our marketplaces. Right now, distributed energy resources do not have the same access as centralized generation to wholesale markets to where energy is bought and sold. Secondly, we need to start valuing clean energy resources appropriately. So if a resource provides additional benefits beyond making sure supply and demand are balanced, so for instance, a resiliency benefit, right? So after a storm, your solar panel plus storage can turn on, right? Which is incredibly important, not just for homeowners, but for community centers, for hospitals, right? That needs to be valued appropriately. Third, we need to build a smarter, not just bigger grid. So building a grid where, for instance, we consider building distributed generation over transmission lines, which are incredibly costly, take years to pay back, but are not given the same cost allocation, not given the same equal opportunity as transmission lines. And lastly, we do need to unlock data access and information for individuals. And so here again, if a consumer is the one who the data concerns, they probably should be the owner of that data. They should be able to leverage that data. They should be able to use that data to become cleaner, to become more cost-effective, become more reliable. We're working on all 4 of these. They all require forward-looking rather than backward-looking change to the electric grid itself, but ultimately they all allow for that trifecta of benefits, right? Reliable, cost-effective, environmentally beneficial. I'm going to close there, so we have time for comments, but thank you all.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so we'll open it up for questions now. The way we're going to do this is we'll have a microphone that we pass out to the audience, and I will pick the lucky winners. And you can ask our panelists questions. Let's start with Peter over there in the 5th row, I think it's.
Thank you. Michael, can you talk to about policies between electric companies and private homeowners, which I know from my own experience has been problematic in terms of both potential for partnerships between electric companies and homeowners to get a bigger scale. In a city like Philadelphia, which is filled with row houses, it would be ideal if they chose to say, okay, let's put it out there and have the energy companies do it. But I think energy companies don't necessarily much like it when individuals put solar cells on their roofs.
Is this on? Perfect. Yeah, so you've asked a question. It's been a couple minutes. It would take a couple hours to dive into this vertical of basically utility ownership and business models. So rather than bore everybody, including myself, with that conversation, what I'm going to do is try to answer it in a very broad way, but forgive me if I'm skipping some detail and some nuance. But in essence, most utility companies are paid based on one thing: distribution lines. They're not paid for power, they're not paid for transmission, they're paid for connecting your home to power. So the more distribution lines they're able to build, the more money they make, right? And that's a business model that's worked, again, for many, many decades, right? And it makes sense, right? We want a very connected grid. It makes sense to incent a utility to act like that. It's been a relatively recent trend that we've seen energy not generated at large centralized generation, but instead in a distributed fashion. If you locate the energy on a home, you don't need to build the same amount of distribution, right? That's a split incentive. I personally don't think it makes sense to create split incentives in an industry like the utility industry, where energy is a necessary commodity. We all need and use electricity. So to untangle or unravel this, you have different states doing different things. You have New York, which has something called REV, which is a process to try to figure out distributed energy alternatives and a way for a utility company and all different actors to want to build out things like rooftop solar. You have places like California that are engaged in something that's called IDSM, Integrated Demand Systems Management, which essentially seeks a similar option. Regardless of what you choose, what we're faced with here is essentially that foundational change. And so we need to figure out the best way to move forward to a world where we are able to value things like energy storage, rooftop solar, et cetera, fairly, and there's not a split incentive to make the right choice, the choice that's not chosen.
Okay. The gentleman in the white hat there.
Hi, I'm Tom Wilson. Although I'm recently retired, I spent over 40 years in the energy efficiency and renewable energy field, actually going back to the early building science work done at Princeton University back in the 70s, and promoting those technologies through low-income weatherization programs, focus on energy, LEED, as well as being involved in various actions regarding power lines and other related kinds of things. What I kind of realized on retirement was that it was essentially a lifetime of fighting for scraps. That every couple of years the funding cycle reemerges, the programs change, a new proposal comes through, and all of the work that we had done before is kind of reshuffled and we start over again. And I realized that if I spend another 45 years, I'd probably still be doing the same thing, which kind of led me to the CCL and realizing that as long as we're following that continued model of expecting government programs or other sources to fund what we're doing, you know, it will be a continuing thing, as opposed to changing the economic model as CCL is trying to do and let the market forces agree on them. So what I am proposing is to start an action group for people involved in conservation renewables, for which there are networks all over the country of hundreds of thousands of people who are involved with this, but largely don't have that political perspective. And so I invite anybody who's interested in that to contact me, and we can begin putting something together so that we can try and bring these techno heads like myself into the political process of supporting the CCL model.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Okay, does somebody have a question out there? I'll take the gentleman in the back, just behind the fellow who's shaking his hand. Okay, the gentleman in the dark hair.
To Eric, about your automobile life cycle emissions, are you factoring in the emissions related in the manufacture of the vehicle in your figures or not?
Yes, it's in there.
Okay.
And it's especially large for electric batteries for the electric vehicles.
Right. My understanding is that the emissions involved in producing a typical car are on the order, if not larger, than the typical emissions generated from the fuel that's burned, or is that a misnomer? How do you see those numbers relating?
Yeah, that's not correct. I would say for a gasoline car, maybe 5 or 10% of life cycle would be from the manufacturing at most. Bigger for electric car.
Let's see, gentleman in the blue and white shirt there.
Hi, I was at a presentation with John Holdren, the President's Science Advisor, where he said that even if we brought emissions levels down to very, very low levels, we'd still need technology to take carbon out of the air because of the amount that's already been dumped into it. So talking about innovations and transformations, does any such technology other than trees exist? Or what do you see on the horizon regarding pulling and sequestering carbon?
So there is technology that can do that. There's a couple of things. Biomass, if you grow trees, use them for energy, but capture the CO2 and bury it along the way. Or build wooden buildings, right? And put the carbon into wood. The volumes are much larger for energy than for construction, though. And there is direct air capture work. We know how to take CO2 out of air, but it's just all very expensive. And to build up to the level that will be needed, the kinds of things John Holdren's talking about, is going to take a lot of money and a lot of time to do it, but it's possible. And the IPCC thinks we're going to need those negative emissions in order to stay within 2 degrees.
Let's get somebody in the back there. A fellow in the red shirt's been waving his hand for a while.
Hello? Okay, good. So I guess this question is for probably Dr. Larson, and I kind of have to preface it really quickly just by saying my understanding is that total vehicle emissions since the recession have plateaued up until I think maybe in the last year or two. They just started to tick back up. And also, at the same time, just recently, as a sector, I don't know if the chart you showed up earlier, I think it said it was 2014, but it had the electric sector as a larger portion of our U.S. national emissions than transportation. And I think just recently, because of the success within the entire electric sector, that's gone down. And transportation as a sector is actually the biggest emission now, at least in June of 2016. Those two things being said, there's some serious concern about the ability of biofuels or any other advanced energies that have not been shown to be commercially viable on a large scale to make transportation as a sector go down fast enough within the US's goals overall. And that's led to a lot of speculation about electrifying like everything, not just light vehicles, but heavy duty, cargo, even aviation to an extent. I don't know how familiar any of you may be with a certain Stanford engineer, Marc Jacobson, and a huge debate there about the potential role for nuclear energy having to play a larger role within our electric sector, not just for electricity generation, but as a way to create more electricity to serve the transportation sector if we really are going to have to electrify more than we're planning on right now. I was just wondering if maybe any of you, actually, it doesn't necessarily have to be Dr. Larson, but if any of you are familiar with that debate as it relates to electrifying transportation, just because we don't know how much solar and wind can do on their own within the little time frame we have.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Well, yeah, I think all of our panelists will have some weigh in on this.
I know Marc Jacobson, but I'm not in detail of the studies that you're talking about. I think to deal with the transportation problem, if we go with electricity, which is a way potentially to get all the way to zero, I think, we may need a lot of nuclear power to do that. And I think the REMI study showed that as one of the scenarios. So you know, there are a lot of other issues with nuclear that come along with it, but carbon is one of its beneficial ones. But to ramp up nuclear in a fashion that could meet the goals that we have is going to be really challenging just because of where the industry is today. That's a comment.
And I can't speak to that point exactly, but I would just add that I think a lot of what we need to do is to look cross-sector and look at the synergies that we can find. For example, in buildings, whether it's parking garages or residential buildings, having EV charging, but then distributed generation, so it's renewable, you know, rooftop solar and powers, you know, it helps charge, and we've got energy storage technologies coming online. So there's a lot of things that policies will enable, as Mike talked about. So that's just one other aspect of it.
Mike, anything to add?
One quick note, which is that, right, if we want to see a world in which electric cars make sense, right, we want to leverage them for the multiple benefits that they provide the grid and that the grid can provide our transport sector, right? So, you know, it really does deal with foundational change. You know, electric vehicles can provide not only an option in the sense that they are cleaner, but they can also provide mini storage, right? If they're optimized to do that, and so they're not only helped by the grid, but they're helping the grid. So again, we get back to we need grassroots advocacy, we need regulatory change to work with the technological change that's already occurring.
Wow, a lot of questions. The young lady in the third row here.
Hi, yeah, I have a couple
Wait for the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my name is Arya McKenna, and I've got a couple layers to my question. One of them is I recently saw the documentary Pump. Are you guys familiar with that documentary? One of the issues that it brings up is how the cars that we are using right now apparently could be reprogrammed to be able to utilize biofuels currently. Is that, I would love to hear you guys speak to that, and also to speak to if we went all out with renewable sources and biofuels with the current reserves that we have in fossil fuels, how long would it take to be able to get off of them? You know, what is the viability of being able to leave those behind as quickly as possible if we really did an all-out scaled effort toward renewables and green technology, including biofuels?
Wonderful question. Perhaps, Eric, maybe you could talk a little bit about the biofuels
Sure.
issue?
So biofuel, you can make biofuels that are essentially indistinguishable from gasoline and diesel. So in the sense, and there's technology to do that. It costs a lot of money, but there is technology to do that. So in that sense, we can use the existing cars, gasoline cars, with biofuels without any difficulty. Ethanol as a biofuel has limitations, but there are other ways to make, there are other types of biofuels.
I just want to add, I have some experience in that area too. Biofuels get a bad rap because everyone thinks of biofuels equals corn ethanol. But there are a lot of technologies that don't get much into the press to make hydrocarbon fuels from biomass sustainably. And those things are technically viable, but right now they're not competitive because the price of oil is low. So if we see a carbon fee and dividend, those investments will come about.
Can I just add, in terms of your second question and how fast to transition, you know, the oil industry built up over 50, 70, 80 years, right, to get to where it is today. And if we're replacing that industry, there's massive investments and change, and foundational change, I guess, is the words that you use, that have to happen. And that's really hard.
We have time for one more question.
Could I add a real quick thing? It is really hard, but if we don't try, we're not going to get there. So we just haven't put it all out, right?
Okay, who wants the final question more than anybody else? There's a gentleman way in the back there that is just waving his arms around. Okay, let's bring the microphone to the back, and this will be the final question, at least during the session.
Hi, this is to any of you guys. It's a really quick question, but I guess it's sort of attached to the previous one. In terms of cost, how long do you think it'll take to transport? So going from like an electrical engineering from renewable sources way into, nope, okay, I'm gonna restart that. So in terms of cost, how long do you think it'll take to switch over from an electrical generation standpoint to a completely non-renewable, renewable sources? I'm sorry. I'm not really good with public speaking, but yeah.
I think the question is clear. How long is it going to take to go to a completely
The transition,
renewable grid?
Yeah.
So, I was actually in Tanzania a few months ago, and looking at their dirty diesel distributed generation systems, and they showed me their solar panel DG that they're very proud of in this particular village. And one of the things he said is, like, finally we got solar, it's so cheap, right? So I think in general, to say that a technology is cheap or not cheap is difficult, because it varies based upon location and also a cost across day. So it's not just true in Tanzania or multiple other countries. It's also true in many, many states that the marginal fuel source, the lowest cost fuel source, can be solar, it can be wind. Oftentimes it is something like energy efficiency, which we just heard about. So the challenge is really twofold. One is, if it's the cheapest source already, technologically speaking, how do we make it not just an adder onto our energy mix, but really truly part of our energy mix? And this gets back to some of those core recommendations that I had, right? Right now, distributed energy resources, rooftop solar, can't take part in energy auctions, where energy is bought and sold daily. That's a systemic problem. It's not a technological problem, it's not a cost problem, it's a regulatory problem, right? It's a policy question. The other piece that's going to be very important here, I see I'm out of time. Find out later.
I think we're out of time. We're CCL, so we do things on time. And it's 5:30 now, so thank you all for coming. And I hope you enjoyed it. And go enjoy your dinner now.